In 1992, private investor David Barry walked into his kitchen and looked at the to-do list stuck to his fridge door. It read, buy eggs, pick up laundry, sue state of Mississippi. Now, I'm not certain whether the eggs and the laundry were ever crossed off the list, but David did wind up in the state treasurer's office in Jackson, Mississippi, where he calmly explained that Mississippi owed him an awful lot of money. To find out why he was there and what the outcome was, stay tuned to this, episode 24 of The Desert Island Investor. This episode of the podcast is generously hosted by Progressive Equity Research. Visit their website at progressive-research.com.
Right, well, I'm absolutely delighted about the castaway who's joined us for this episode. He's somebody that's often featured in the financial press over the last 2 to 3 decades, and it's a case of where to start. It's a varied, rich and colourful story. He's a non-dom, born in Guernsey. He's been an investment banker, antiques dealer, activist investor, significant shareholder, above 3%, in a number of listed businesses. He's lived in Spain for a number of years, been a gold prospector, and even sued the state of Mississippi. And I'm sure there's much I've missed out. Now, he's not entertained this kind of thing previously, so I'm really appreciative that he's agreeing to join us, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And I fear time will be our enemy. So it's a good friend of mine, David Barry. David, thank you and welcome to Investor Island.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for that intro. And it's obviously a huge honor for me, and I'm looking forward to it.
Right. Well, first up, when people talk about their background, they often started around 18 as though everything that preceded it was of no consequence. But our lives are generally molded very early on. Now, my father was a joiner, and my mother manufactured slippers before becoming a housewife. And I was raised in a terraced house in East Lancashire, sharing a bedroom with my brother. Now, my childhood was largely uneventful, but what it did provide my younger brother and myself was stability and support. And that in itself was a great start. Now, my parents taught us the value of money, and this was something that we did not have the luxury to squander. Now, I started investing early and would not have envisaged back then the life and choices that I have available today. So that's enough about me. What was early life like for David Barry?
Well, my background is that both my Irish father and my mother's French parents emigrated to Guernsey in the Channel Islands, where I was born years ago, seeking work, a long time ago, obviously. My mum and dad had really hard lives. They had very little money. They lived through the German occupation of Guernsey, but they didn't meet and marry until after that, in the 1950s. When I was a child, we didn't have a television or a telephone or a car. I did have my own bedroom, unlike you, so I didn't have to sleep with my sister. My father died when I was 6, and I have consequently very little recollection of him. So I suppose my childhood background was pretty disadvantaged, but I don't remember feeling disadvantaged at the time. But I guess my parents' tough, difficult lives might have encouraged me to try and make something better of my life. And I obviously have a much better life than my parents did, for sure.
Okay, well, what did Mum do to keep the wolf from the door then, David?
I think we lived on benefits, basically, if I'm honest. My mother wasn't well either. She had cancer when I was very young. And she lost my father very soon after the marriage, just 6 years. I think we pretty much lived on benefit. Fortunately, my father, who was a building labourer, and his friends managed to build a house. They bought a plot for £60 and built a little bungalow So at least we had a house.
Right. Well, I can see that line of questioning has backfired on me, as I did at least want to win the battle of modest beginnings. So
There you go.
You've outdone me there, David. At least you weren't an orphan. But if we fast forward a little bit, I suppose it really took off for you when you became involved in investment banking with Sovereign Management. Now, Credit Suisse bought out Sovereign in 1988, and you left a couple of years later. So was this part of the deal, or did you decide that you just wanted to try something else? And you were still very young, a young man with lots ahead of you. Did you have a clear plan for the future?
Yeah. Well, I was very fortunate to become a director and a shareholder very early in my career with this company. And I was earning a lot more than I would have done as an employee quite quickly. We did sell the company to Credit Suisse in the late 1980s, and I received what seemed to me at that time to be a very large sum. I never felt that I would want to enjoy working in a big international organization. So I had to continue to work there for a mandatory 2-year post-acquisition period, which I did. And then I left. And I had no particular plan except that I wanted to make money and to be my own boss.
Right. Well, you tried your hand at antiques. So I think this was one of the first things you turned to. So was this something that you had prior knowledge of, and was it enjoyable or successful?
I don't really have any great knowledge of antiques, but I had some friends who did have great knowledge, and they invited me to become a shareholder in a new retail operation in London. So I was a shareholder and a director, and this went on for a few years. We had a little retail outlet. It was in Portobello Road, actually, but we also showed at various antique fairs around the country. The big fairs like the Grosvenor House Antique Fair, which is the biggest, most prestigious fair in England, I think, still. I wouldn't say it was hugely successful, no. It was interesting and amusing at times. That's about the most I can say about it.
Well, I suppose those are some positives. And this gold prospecting, so it wasn't in the Klondike, but in of all places, Spain. So again, how did you become involved in this, and did you hit the mother lode?
Well, again, it was some friends of mine who had another very good idea for me. And they were geologists, exploration geologists, and they persuaded me that it would be a good idea to set up and invest in a company to acquire these licenses to explore for gold in Leon y Castile province in Spain. And this is where the Romans used to extract gold. They extracted masses of gold. Over a 250-year period, they mined 16 tons of gold in Spain. But when I say mined, they just kind of panned for gold. They didn't have the technology to mine as we would today. So certainly there was gold there. And there's no doubt about that. So we did discover gold, if you like. It was there already, but we didn't. We ran out of money before we had the opportunity to prove the commercial viability of it using modern mining techniques. So we were fortunate in that we managed to engineer a reverse takeover by a US oil and gas producer ultimately. So we did, in fact, float it on the main stock market as part of that. But obviously we were heavily diluted.
Yeah. So was that a name that we recognise today, David, the oil and gas company, and is it still in existence in some form?
I don't think so. I don't think it is.
Okay.
There have been so many junior exploration and production companies in mining and oil and gas, and the vast majority disappear after a bit, I'm afraid.
Okay. So separate to that, you did live in Spain for a number of years, and did that present any problems managing investments? I always fear that if I moved to Mauritius permanently, that I'd become detached from the UK market and I'd lose that local knowledge and what we absorb around us by what you could call osmosis.
I don't think I would have any problem operating an investment portfolio from anywhere in the world, so long as I have internet access. And I think it might actually be better to be somewhat detached from market noise. maybe on a desert island or something like that.
Yeah. Well, precisely. Okay. And we've got to explore this attempt to sue the state of Mississippi. So this isn't David versus Goliath. This is David versus Mississippi. This sounds like a major play. Please share this with us, David.
Okay, so this was my most ambitious get-rich scheme. For a long time, I had an interest in collecting historic share certificates and bond certificates. And I found out that a couple of banks in Mississippi had issued a lot of US dollar bonds in the 1830s, principally to British investors. I think it was actually sponsored by Barings Bank. And these bonds were actually guaranteed by the state of Mississippi. And in just a very small number of years, these banks collapsed. I think it was connected to the collapse in the cotton market and the price of cotton. Anyway, they collapsed and the bonds fell into default in 1842. So they stopped paying interest on these bonds in 1842. And since then, they've never paid a cent in interest or principal. And the state of Mississippi has never honored its guarantee. So in the early 1990s, I managed to sort of acquire the bulk of the outstanding bonds with a view to seeking repayment. I located several other smaller bondholders, and I recruited them as potential co-plaintiffs against Mississippi. One of these was the legendary Canadian value investor, the late Peter Cundill. Anyway, I flew to Jackson eventually, Jackson, the capital of Mississippi, the state capital, and immediately on arrival, I telephoned the state treasurer's office, and I patiently explained to the bemused receptionist that I required the state to repay my several $1 million of principal and interest on my 160-year-old bonds, pursuant to their guarantee. And I don't know what I expected to happen, but within an hour, I was sitting in the state treasurer's office with the state treasurer, the attorney general, and various legal counsel. So they were pretty keen to meet with me, and they certainly knew all about this matter, this debt. But they did make it pretty clear after a lengthy discussion that they were not going to pay me any money. So I informed them they would be hearing from my lawyers in due course. I managed to find a firm in Jackson, a great man who was a great history buff and also a lawyer, and he was prepared to represent me against the state, primarily on a contingent fee basis. So, in return for a percentage of any future settlement. So we did sue the state of Mississippi in the state courts in 1993, looking for the principal and 150 years of interest. And we spent the next several years in court suing and appealing various cases on behalf of about 30 British and US bondholders who I'd got together. Sadly, as in my previous antiques and mining exploration ventures, we were ultimately unsuccessful, and the bonds remain in default to this day. But as a postscript to that story, happily for me, some years later, I did make a substantial profit on them. The collector's market in historic bond certificates is occasionally seized by a spectacular demand for defaulted bonds for no apparent reason. This has happened several times with Chinese bonds, which have been in default and still are. But in about 1998, there was an extraordinary surge in the value of Mississippi's defaulted bonds. And I was approached by various dealers looking to buy my bonds, buy my US bonds from me. Ultimately, one dealer was very, very keen to buy my entire holding. And this was for many times their original cost. So I flew to the US with the bonds in my suitcase, and I sold the whole lot. And a week or so later, as usually happens with these sudden price explosions, the bonds' values crashed completely back to where they were, which was very little. So I was very fortunate to make quite a significant sum in the end.
That's some rare good timing, that, and probably another example of one of these bubbles, these various bubbles that we read about, and it's another classic. It's not exactly tulips or crypto, but it seemed to be these bonds that you've mentioned.
Yeah, it has happened on many occasions, and I'm sure it'll probably happen again. And it's on these bonds, but they have to be still current, not cancelled, as it were. So outstanding, as indeed they are in China and Russia, etc.
Okay, well, I think we'll turn now to the world in which I operate, if that's okay, and that's UK equities. And over the years, you've been a significant shareholder, and that's classed as a holding over 3% that has to be notified to the wider market. And that's been the case for a number of listed companies. So how many are you currently a significant shareholder in, David? And how many would you say there have been in your investing career?
I think I'm currently a 3% shareholder in about half a dozen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I think I've probably been a significant shareholder of 3% plus in a couple of dozen over the years.
Okay, so this is information that's in the public domain. Could you just share which those companies are, David, at the moment?
I think at the moment I'm a 3% shareholder in Nexus Infrastructure. In fact, there was an announcement today on that one, coincidentally. Heavy Tree Brewery, Titan Holdings, Tandem Group, and Riverfort Global Opportunities. I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay. And over the years, how many would you say that you've been a significant shareholder, and if you were to tally them all up?
A couple of dozen or so.
Right. Okay. All right. So, can you? I'm looking forward to the day where I'm going to be a 3% shareholder in Unilever or something like that, David. So it's not something I'm well up with. But can you just share the process of it for advising the stock market when you've exceeded that 3% threshold, please?
Okay. Well, you can use an online portal, which is obligatory for main market notifications. But in the case of AIM companies, you can use that portal, or you are still permitted to just email a form TR1 to the company, which is how I do it. That's permissible for AIM companies, but not for main market companies. So, as you probably know, the notifications are required when you exceed 3%, and then when you cross a percentile more or less thereafter, until you reach below 3%, then you don't need to notify anymore.
Okay, right. Well, do you need to keep your wits about you, because lots of companies are they're creating more shares there, and also they're doing buybacks. So the number of shares in circulation is changing. Do you have to have your wits about you? And if you fail to report that you've gone through one of these thresholds, is there any penalty?
Well, personally, having made a notification after acquisition of shares, I don't make any further notifications if the company's share capital changes. Now, it may well be, you're probably right, that I have probably a technical obligation to do so, but I've never had any comeback on this. I don't think it's policed particularly. I've often seen people with holdings which they haven't notified, which should have been notified, or people notifying a month or 2 or 3 months late. So I don't think these things are heavily policed, unless maybe if there was a big company involved in a takeover situation, they might take a much closer eye on it. But I've never had any comeback or queries about the notifications I've made. But I don't really track it after I've made a notification, after I bought the shares or sold the shares. I don't tend to make any further notifications if something happens, like they issue some shares under option or something like that, and that changes my percentile. I don't notify. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, you've been described as an activist investor, and I'm certain that I suspect in certain investments you've been activist and others passive. So, in what ways over the years would you say that you've shaken things up, David?
Well, I've really only been active in very, very small companies. So I've made tender offers for up to 30%, which is the limit you can get to without a full offer. I've made tender offers for a few small unlisted public companies to try and get influence or de facto control. I've called occasional EGMs for listed companies on AIM, tabled resolutions at AGMs, to nominate directors or to challenge governance issues, corporate governance issues, to shake them up a bit. But it's not something I've really done for some time now. I think it's much more difficult now when so many shares are held by shareholders on platforms, so you don't have access. You're allowed to. You can seek a company's. If you're a shareholder, you can seek a company's shareholder list, which gives you the names and addresses. But they're mostly held these days on platforms, so doesn't really tell you very much, as it is. It's not as much as it used to anyway.
Yeah, and I would have thought this was a lost cause, like perhaps some others. But in the late 90s, you actually got involved investing in some football clubs.
Yeah, I thought football clubs were a good thing to invest in the late 90s because they weren't quoted. Maybe Manchester United might have been quoted, but most of them weren't quoted, but you could still trade the shares. And they were held largely by fans, so there was usually a dominant local bigwig who controlled the thing in effect. But most of the free shares were held by fans. And the market capitalization of these clubs was like £5 to £10 million. And this was, and they had, a squad of players who were worth, 30, 40 million each, probably in the what was the first division, I suppose, in those days. And they had huge, great stadiums and property in this. So I thought this is obviously ridiculously cheap. And you had to contact a stock. There was usually a stockbroker for example, in Liverpool, Blankston Sington, who I think recently actually sadly went bust. They operated the market in Liverpool and Everton shares. And you had to deal with the broker who was in the town who dealt with the shares. So I bought a lot of shares in these companies: Arsenal, Aston Villa, Liverpool, Everton, Rangers. And I was buying them from the fans, and they were bought, and you had to just buy them in very small lots from the football fans, who obviously wanted to realise them for one reason or another. And then, of course, this kind of thing took off with football clubs, and a lot of them got quoted. Yeah, I had shares in Aston Villa, for example, and I had shares with Aston Villa had shares with 1 vote, and then had another class of shares with 15 votes per share. And I bought a lot of the latter ones with lots of votes. And then when they floated the company, the chairman, Doug Ellis, sought to tidy up the share register, so he proposed a reorganization. And he should have just given the multi-vote shares one sort of bonus share to compensate them for losing their votes, because the share price before that was like 2 to 1. The 15-vote shares were twice the price of the 1-vote shares. But anyway, he gave them 14 bonus shares. So they were worth 14 times the original the other share price, or 7 or 8 times their original price. And then it was floated on the stock market and went up. So that was a fantastic investment for me early on in my sort of investing. It was a 25 bagger.
Wow.
in a very short period of time.
Yeah. So these weren't out of any kind of loyalty to any kind of club. This was a purely kind of investment decision, was it, David?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
They were all just ridiculously cheap. I mean, there were shares. Players were changing hands for the same price as the market cap of the club. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right. Well, I didn't think anybody made money out of football other than players and their agents. So,
there you go.
Right. Well, it sounds like you've tried many different styles. So, what's worked for you and what hasn't? And have you now settled on an investment style, or would you say it's still evolving?
I think I've always been interested only really in very small companies, which I would call nano cap rather than even micro cap, because even micro cap companies now can be a few hundred million market cap. But I'm much, much lower than that. And I like to see assets. I like to see a low price to book value ratios. So that's really my style, which is pretty simple and straightforward. But over the years, I've often been seduced by other silly ideas and lost money consequently by deviating from that style. So I try very hard not to do that anymore. But I'm still making mistakes and still doing stupid things. But there you go.
Yeah. And are there key areas that you avoid?
Well, I avoid mineral exploration, for example, gold exploration. I avoid that with like the plague, I avoid basically materials, mining, oil and gas. I'm not really into pharmaceuticals and high-tech stuff, high technology, really. And I'm not really into investing outside the UK because whenever I've done that, I seem to have come unstuck,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some people fear the shares being delisted, but when we've chatted in the past, you told me that some of your best investments have come via this route.
Yeah, I think small shareholders understandably tend to panic a bit when a company announces a delisting and they all sell. So that supplies a buying opportunity. But I tend to have large, and they're frightened of illiquidity, of course. I can't sell my shares, it's delisted. But, that can provide a buying opportunity. So depending on whether the company is about to go bust or what. So you can pick up shares there. And as I tend to invest in significant sort of stakes in very, very small companies, I don't have to worry. I don't really worry about illiquidity because I can't really worry about illiquidity because my shares, most of my holdings are illiquid anyway. And if they get delisted, it doesn't really make much difference to me, frankly.
Mm. And through that delisting, I suppose there's things like you strip out a lot of costs of actually having to be on the stock market and things like non-execs and glossy reports and all those extras.
There are tons of companies on the AIM market that shouldn't be listed at all, in my opinion, because of the costs, and you can strip out a lot of costs. But I think when companies delist, I think management integrity becomes very important because there's obviously more ways in which they can mess it up. They can mess around the share, they can screw the shareholders if they're sorry to use that word, but if they're delisted, if they're not listed, there's less protection for the minority.
Okay, well, so are you solely focused on the UK now, David?
Yeah, I am now. Whenever I've strayed from that into places like I've had bought shares in companies in Ukraine and not in Ukraine, English companies, British companies operating in Ukraine and Bulgaria and Hungary and India and God knows where. But I've given that up. I tried very hard to give that up. I hope I've given it up anyway, because it just doesn't work for me,
Yeah, well, you've got to stay. We've all got to stay within our circle of competence, haven't we? And
that's it.
I very much think my circle's a lot smaller than your circle, David.
I'm not sure about that.
So in the last year, we've met several times. We had a really nice lunch at the Royal Baths Chinese restaurant in Harrogate, which I really enjoyed, especially as you paid. And then we met at the Drum and Monkey, again in Harrogate, which unfortunately I had to pay on that occasion. But we've had regular conversations and we've shared thoughts and ideas. And in general, have you been somebody that's collaborated and cross-fertilized on ideas? I'm not on about actually joint investments. Or have you acted solely upon your own research and acted of pretty much a lone wolf?
I've acted really pretty much as a lone wolf in terms of relying on my own research, because I think I need to have a strategy and I need to stick to that strategy and not be distracted by other people's ideas. I'm not saying I'm any smarter than them. In fact, I might not be as smart as them. They might have better ideas, but if I don't stick to I don't feel comfortable at all if I don't stick to my strategy. And whenever I've strayed from it, I've tended to not do very well. So I tend to just not be very interested in other people's ideas. So obviously I used to collaborate with people, especially in activist situations where you'd work with other people to try and force some change. But more recently, I don't kind of sit around a table and discuss ideas with people of investment. But I'm always interested to hear if they come up with something that meets my criteria that I've not come across, because that's the other problem is finding these things, because there's such a lot of companies to look at. Even in these very small companies, there was many more companies to look at if you're looking at very small companies, actually.
Mm. So are you strictly an investor, or have you traded as well? And do you have a typical investment period? And what's your boredom threshold like?
I suppose a typical investment period could be a few years. I'm certainly not a trader. I'm an investor, but I don't have any objection to making a fast buck if an opportunity arises. And I have got a pretty high boredom threshold, and I have held some stocks for 20 years or even more. So yeah.
Yeah, I suppose given those large holdings that you've got in small companies, it doesn't lend itself to trading, does it? Because as you said earlier on, you're locked in very much, aren't you? That's the thing. It's they're illiquid. There's a wide spread. It's not conducive to bouncing in and out.
You're locked in until something happens to crystallize the value. Really, yeah.
Yeah. So do you have a broad or a concentrated portfolio, and has this always been the case?
I've always had a pretty concentrated portfolio. I'd love to have a portfolio of, let's say 10 stocks maximum, but I've never really achieved that. There's always a few little scrappy legacy investments in there as well. But yeah, I think it's very important to have a concentrated portfolio. I don't think diversification. Do you need diversification can often be diversification, isn't it? I think if you're going to diversify too much, you're just going to follow the market, aren't you? You're just a tracker, really.
Yes.
So I would prefer a concentrated portfolio. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you like I attend AGMs and talk with management, but you've stated that in many ways it's largely pointless as they can't share any sensitive information. So are we simply wasting our time, David, going to AGMs?
I think the most useful takeaway is often from conversations with other long-time investors who attend. Although a lot of the meetings I attend, as I think you know, there's hardly anyone there apart from you and me and the board. But I think AGMs are becoming less useful. As I said before, many holders are using platforms, so it doesn't facilitate attendance at AGMs because these platforms don't necessarily assist with that. And I think I've already seen some AGMs going online only, and I suspect that may be a trend, and that ultimately that will be the future of AGMs. And I think a lot of managements, particularly small companies, would probably welcome that, and it enables them to control the AGM much more and to curate the questions and, ignore the questions they don't want to answer, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it will be easier for them to control those dissenting shareholders when they're online rather than in a room. And, I've got to say that, sometimes that we are dissenting shareholders, but most of the time I like to think that we're positive. But I think this is something that we've got to watch, that it's our only opportunity to get in front of people, and hopefully we don't get frozen out in the future. So, I've got some confusion when asked about my occupation. And sometimes, depending on who it is, I declare that I'm retired. And other times I said I'm a private investor, depending on the circumstances. So what about you, David?
I usually just tell people I'm retired, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't particularly want to tell people I'm a private investor.
Okay, well, this is going out on the internet now, David. So that's going to get out. But, so, do you think you're still improving as an investor, or are your powers waning?
I like to think I'm improving, but I don't. I think I'm probably waning, to be honest. But I think investment performance is quite dependent on the time I spend. And I don't spend nearly as much time on research now as I did in the past, because when I was more active, I didn't have children and family and stuff, and now I do. And so, yeah, I think if I spent more time, I'd make more money. But
right. Well, you're understandably enjoying the fruits of your labours, David. And you, I've two children, and I'm pleased to say both of them are now showing an interest in investing. Now, my daughter in particular has been bitten by the bug, which is encouraging, especially as hopefully her and my son will be recipients of something along the way from myself. So what about the Barry offspring?
Yeah, my son is hugely interested in investment. Or really, to be truthful, he's hugely interested in money. So it sees investment as a possible way to accumulate some. But he's only young, but he's really just gambling, to be honest, in my opinion. Although he has had some success with his smallish portfolio. So, I try to encourage him to invest rather than to gamble. But he's young and he can afford to gamble. I guess.
With the younger generation, everything's more instant now. It seems to be, even if you look at the whole world in which we operate, we want instant results, don't we? If you look at cricket, exactly. Cricket used to be test match cricket, then one day cricket, then it went to 2020, and now it's the 100, and the whole world, it seems to be want to things quicker and quicker.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go on about the non-DOMs. So I was listening to our Prime Minister yesterday in his garden. He's going to say he's going to crack down on the non-DOMs. I don't know what that means, but with these quirks of birth, you were born in Guernsey, and unlike the UK, there's no inheritance tax, which is something I'm beginning to factor into my portfolio and my personal exposure to AIM. And does being a non-DOM bring any drawbacks, David?
I think the advantages are greater than the drawbacks. I mean, I'm resident in UK at the moment, and have been for a few years. But I obtained my non-DOM status, and I'm moving back to Guernsey next year. I suppose if you're a non-DOM living overseas, then and not. I suppose it's a drawback if you want to spend time in the UK. You can't spend so much time in the UK. I guess that might be a drawback. I mean, I feel I was very fortunate to be born in Guernsey, and I've always been a non-DOM. And at the present time, I think my sons are non-DOMs because you take your domicile from your father. What they'll do in the future, I don't know. They might not. They might, if they stay in the UK, they'll become UK domiciled, obviously. But yeah, inheritance tax is a hugely, very, very high rate of tax. I think it's the highest inheritance tax in the UK in Europe, isn't it?
It's a mere 40%, David.
A mere 40%. It's extraordinary, yeah. So
yeah, for the privilege of dying.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that money's been taxed numerous times. And I suppose that they have no inheritance tax. I mean, you invest in small caps, but for you, I suppose it offers you greater freedom. You have a broader spectrum, because it's not a consideration where I've got to look at perhaps some more esoteric investments, some AIM listed or other type businesses.
I suppose so. But by its nature, my investments are primarily on the AIM anyway, because they're all very, very small companies, and obviously it's cheaper to be on the AIM. So I don't suppose that has a bearing. But there's no guarantee, obviously, that this exemption for AIM companies will continue. It's very peculiar, in my opinion, anyway, that the AIM companies are exempt from inheritance tax and main market companies aren't. So it may well be that will change.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Right. Well, here on Investor Island, you're welcome to share the resources that Paul and I have got available, and all we ask is that you share a stock from your portfolio that we consider for the treasure chest. So this isn't. We're not in the nature of stock tipping and the kind of, it could be anything. It could be your largest holding, your smallest, a disaster, something that you've recently added to, or just something for us to chew around, David. So what have you got for us?
Okay, well, I hate giving tips, and so it's not a tip, as you say, and I hate giving tips because whenever I give anyone a tip, it usually goes wrong. And whenever I listen to anyone else's tip and act on it, that usually goes wrong too. So, I have a small holding in a company. I'm not sure I'm going to buy any more, but I have a small holding in a company called FIH Group, which used to be called Falkland Island Holdings. So it used to operate in the Falklands, doing all sorts of stuff in tourism, retail, construction, insurance, automobiles, all that. And I just think it's quite an intriguing company. Some years back, they sought to diversify themselves. I guess they thought they were just too dependent on Falkland Islands, so with Argentina constantly rattling their sabers, and they bought the Portsmouth Harbour Ferry, which goes from Gosport across the harbour in Portsmouth. They bought that, which is a profitable monopoly transport company, shipping company. And they bought a thing called Momart, which does international art logistics and storage. So this is shifting works of art around the world and looking after them, which is quite a specialist thing, I imagine. So those are the three bits of the company now. So it's a mini conglomerate. Its only market cap's only about 30 million. And it's a little conglomerate. Conglomerates used to be quite the thing back in the day, but I'm not sure that it's the thing now. And I think this is interesting because it's got these three parts. And I think maybe it'd be worth more if they just went back to being Falkland Islands, and they're not exactly making a huge return on capital. The price to book value is about 0.73, but if you look at the accounts, they state in the accounts in the notes, it says that the investment property in the Falkland Islands, which is lots of property they've got for which they rent out, is actually worth 5 million more than book value. And they go on to say that the Momart warehouse, which is somewhere in East London, has a value well in excess of 24.7 million, well in excess of that. And that's in the books at 18.5 million. So that's another 6 million plus in value, which is not on the balance sheet. So that brings the price to book value down to about below 0.6 anyway. In the recent accounts, for the first time, they paid a special dividend. I think it's for the first time. I might be wrong. A special dividend in addition to the usual annual dividend. It was only 10p. The shares are about £2.40, £2.50, I think. So they paid a 5.5p dividend, but they also paid a special dividend of 10p in addition. So that was quite interesting, I thought. So this is very illiquid. It has three quite disparate businesses. It's not making a huge return on them. It's not making a huge return on its asset value, which I say it's substantially above the market cap. They have a strange share register with 24% or something, or is it more than that? Might even be a bit more than that, owned by Jerry Zucker's family trust. He's the late Jerry Zucker. He was some American multimillionaire, so he's the biggest shareholder. And that trust has got a representative on the board. And another guy, a Swiss company called Janser Group, and they own 12%. They've got a representative on the board. So it's all kind of intriguing, and I think I might go to the AGM, which is next month, because although I say that AGMs are not very helpful, sometimes it's a good opportunity to ask questions, and sometimes it's more difficult for them to dodge the questions if you're at the AGM than it is if you're just writing to them or texting them. Another intriguing thing about it is that if you look at ADVFN's bulletin boards, and I don't really read bulletin boards that much because there's a lot of idiots there writing rubbish, but there is a person there who claims to have contacts and connections within the Falkland Islands, who says that the entire construction team and management team in the Falklands has resigned. And she said this some months ago. So I think that's quite intriguing. So if I get the AGM, I have to ask that question: is this true? And sort of thing you might think they ought to announce, really, if that's the case. But
so this AGM, it's not in Port Stanley, is it, David? You're not going to go?
It's not in Port Stanley. I'd love to go to Port Stanley, but it's in London, so. I can't go to Falklands, Port Stanley, and put it on the expenses for the AGM. No.
Yeah, well, I was vaguely familiar with this business, and I had a look at it when you said you were going to mention this one. And it, like you say, it's a bit of an eclectic collection of businesses, isn't it? You've got this Falkland Islands. We seem to have the tentacles into almost everything that's going on the island in all kinds of whether into retail, food, electrical goods, residential property, selling 4x4s, travel services of various descriptions. So there's that. And then you've got the harbour business, which, as I say, looks like it could be a monopoly, but I would imagine that's quite consistent. That, and then this Momart. So you've looked at the value thing, but for somebody like me, where I look for an element of growth, and I'm not sure, for me personally, where that comes. Is there going to be any kind of stellar growth of that? Or could we use that word? It could be potentially a value trap. This, if you can't get any growth.
It could be a value trap. Absolutely. I agree. That's why I said I'm not necessarily going to buy any more shares in it.
Yeah.
But I might go down to London because it's in London. It's easy to get to,
Yeah.
and ask a few questions.
Yeah. I mean, I did have a good look at it, and I was very impressed with the amount of detail that they put on. There's a lot of detail in that report. I mean, on the ferry side, they have the amount, the reliability rate. They have the number of weekday passengers, weekend passengers, average yield per passenger, and then on the Falkland Islands, they have their occupancy rates and what the elects, I think, squid catches in tons, things like that. I don't even know what that is, but the number of passengers in numbers, and then even on the Moormark side, the percentage of the capacity that's being used in the warehouse. So there's lots of visibility in that. Something that we mentioned previously, Paul and I, about non-execs. They've got a couple in this business. Robert Johnston, he's got 3.7 million shares at about £2.50. That's a good few million, but he's only pulling out 30k. So that
he's the guy who represents the trust, I think.
Right. Okay.
I think he's the big shareholder. He's the bigger shareholder's representative on the board, I believe.
Okay. And then there's a Holger Schroeder. Is it? He's got 1.5 million shares, and
he's the guy. Yeah. He's the guy from last. Sorry to interrupt you. He's the guy just been on last year. He's the guy from this company, a Swiss company called Janssen Group, who's turned up as a shareholder. Yeah.
Yeah.
So between them, it's very much sort of controlled. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
but he's only been on the board for 9 months.
Yeah.
And he's only pulled out 25 grand. So these are guys who are more interested, I would suggest, on the investment rather than pulling out a salary of it, because it's just a minimal stake they're taking out. But it's certainly an interesting business. Let's see where it goes. I mean, one last thing, I do like cash. They've got 9.7 million cash, but 12.3 million pounds of debt, which seems a little bit odd from the outside, but
yeah, I don't understand that.
Yeah. Right, David, all I can say is thanks very much. Paul's been tending to the fire whilst we've been chatting. He's been keeping us warm. Paul, did you enjoy that?
Yes, that was extremely interesting. I'm looking forward to a thumbnail involving some American hand of justice being pointed at David's head. And so it was a very, very interesting story. It's very interesting.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, we all good?
Yeah.
All right, I'll press the stop button. Well, that's all for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember the content is for information only and it is not financial advice. If you have a question for Mark for our Question in a Bottle podcast, just complete the form on our website, thedesertislandinvestor.co.uk. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.